I invite you to turn in your Bibles this morning to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. We'll be looking at verses 8 through 21 this morning. You've heard it said, and you have probably said it yourself to your friends or your children or your grandchildren or to your spouse. You may have said at some point in time, life is a series of choices. You ever heard that? You ever said that? That's so true. Like the saying goes, as mighty oaks from small acorns grow, we make our decisions, and our decisions turn around and make us. We opened the book of Daniel last week, and we find Daniel, the teenager, facing a crisis in Babylon. And today in our text, we'll see that he's about to make a choice that will radically change his whole life. And as we read about it, we may think in today's context and setting, well, this was really no big deal. But to Daniel, it turned out to be a very big deal. Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So we listened to them in this manner and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. I don't know about that, but we're just reading the text today here. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel and his friends are in Babylon now. They have been torn away from their families in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army. These God-fearing Jewish teenagers, ripped out of everything they have known, are now being put into a program to be trained to work for a pagan king. Last week we described this as Operation Assimilation. You remember that? This Operation Assimilation is the king is going to make sure that these guys get the best Babylonian education that is offered. For 3 years, they will be immersed in Babylonian knowledge, culture, history, language, and religion. Their Jewish names are changed in favor of new Babylonian names. And the plan was, at the end of the 3 years, after going through all of this assimilation, all of this training, then they are going to be entered into the king's service in a high-level government position. As we said last week, this was something that looks like, man, these guys are going to have it made. They are on the fast track to becoming muckety-mucks in the king's service. Really what it was a sophisticated term of brainwashing. And the purpose was to make them forget their past, forget their heritage, and become loyal to the king and become loyal to that pagan way of life that was displayed, that was demanded by that culture and that country. Now, everything seems to be going smoothly until one of the guys, Daniel, decides he's not going to go along with the program. And this is a very crucial event in his life. And I think it's fair if we look back from our perspective now, Daniel's decision may appear to be kind of odd to us. Now, granted, we aren't Jews living in Babylonian captivity. So it's hard for us maybe to understand what the big fuss was about eating the king's food at the king's table. As far as we can tell, Daniel accepted the bondage. He went with the program. He accepted the education part. He even appeared to accept the new name that was given him. And we would think today, if you're going to go along with all of this, why mess with the groceries? Why mess with the food that's going to be there on the king's table? What's the big deal about this? Well, Daniel had to make 3 important decisions every day of his life. He just had to decide whether he's going to take part in the education program. Well, he thought, all right, I can take part in this, and I can just discard those things I know to be untrue. I can just forget about the things I need to learn, except for the test. Remember for the test and just forget about the rest of the stuff. He had to think about that. He had to put up with being called a pagan name. You kind of wonder if they begin to call him Belteshazzar, and he's just standing there looking around like, I wonder who they're talking to. And then, oh yeah, okay, that's me. I'm Belteshazzar now. But even giving into that, he knew that being called a name alone couldn't define who he really was. When people call me stupid, I know I'm not stupid. So I may be an idiot sometimes, but he went along with that. But when it came to the food, he had to make a decision concerning that. And it was at this point that he couldn't escape what it represented. And what seems to be, maybe to us, the least important issue was the most important to Daniel. And it was important to him because he had some sense of priorities in his life. He knew that eventually, at some point in time, you've got to draw the line and say, no farther. No, I'm not stepping over this line. This is as far as I'm going to go. I will not go and do this. And there were at least several problems with the food that was being served at the king's table. One thing, it would not have been prepared according to the kosher laws of the Old Testament. Much of it would be ritually unclean. All the wine and most of the meat would have been offered to pagan gods. And to eat that food in that situation, Daniel knew, if I'm going to eat that food that's been offered to pagan gods, then I'm endorsing that paganism. I'm endorsing that way of thinking, that way of life. They'll be able to come back and say, well, you don't have any problems eating the food. Why are you putting up with such a fuss now? He knew that was one of the problems. And he also knew that sharing a meal at the king's table represented sharing the king's value. Even today, as we eat together. Some will be going out to eat after church today. You will have some friends that will gather and you'll go to eat. You know what that sort of implies? That you kind of like each other. It implies friendship. It implies support. It implies some sense of endorsement of who you are as a person. Yeah, well, let's go out to eat together. Let's do this. It implies some sense of shared values. So in the end, Daniel could obey the king and even serve in his government, but he could not pretend to be his friend. You see, to eat that food in that situation represented a moral compromise in everything that Daniel believed in. So he made up his mind, I'm not going to do it. No, I'm not going to take part in that. And this is hugely important because it teaches us this principle. You can't corrupt a person from the outside. You can do all of these things. You can change a culture, but you can't change a character. You can change a name, but you can't change the nature. Now, Daniel may have looked like a pagan, but on the inside, he was still a servant of the living God. And even that mighty king, Nebuchadnezzar, could not do anything about that. He was who he was from his inside there. Let's pause for just a moment and think about what Daniel was risking. He risked making the king angry, who wouldn't appreciate hearing that some teenage kid from Israel didn't want to eat at his table. That would not go over well. And matter of fact, no way could that be made to sound good to the king. That was being rebellious, and we know how ancient kings dealt with the rebellion. Off went the head, or whatever type of corporal punishment. So literally, Daniel was putting his life on the line when he says, no, I'm not going to eat at the king's table or the king's food. He was also spoiling his own chances for advancement. Nebuchadnezzar could say, all right, you guys have gone through 3 years of education, of knowing the history, language, culture, and all of this stuff. But Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, I've got a good job for you. Daniel, not so much because, buddy, you didn't play right when it came to eating the food that I offered you. There's a saying that goes like this: you can't climb the ladder while you're rocking the boat. And that was true. He stood a good chance of kissing his future goodbye. But verse 9 adds a very crucial fact when it says, and God gave favor. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Some of your translations may say this, but God. You know what happens now? God enters the picture. It's not just about Daniel. Now then, God is entering the picture. He caused Ashpenaz to look with favor upon Daniel and his 3 friends. But notice when that happened. That happened after the decision Daniel had made, not before. Does God bless those who honor Him? Sure He does. But you know what? We don't generally experience those blessings until we stand up for what we believe. Daniel took a stand for what he believed, and then God entered into the picture. There's a blessing reserved for the bold that the timid will never experience. Daniel's proposal was very simple. He asked that he and his 3 friends be taken off the rich diet and be served only vegetables and water for 10 days. At the end of that time, then the guard can make his own comparison and draw his own conclusions. And notice how Daniel even made his proposal. First thing he did was he was very tactful in the way he spoke. He didn't demand anything. He just simply made a request. Second thing, he followed protocol. He followed the chain of command. He spoke to the person that he needed to speak to. He didn't try to go over or around somebody's people of responsibility. And another thing, his request was reasonable. It was a test. It would be over 10 days and didn't require the preparation of any unusual food or anything. It was a very simple request. Just give us vegetables and water. That's all we need. And fourth, it was very easy to evaluate. The guard just simply eyeballed the 4 versus the others, and he could make his decision, draw his own conclusions for there. Now, verses 15 and 16 tells us at the end of the 10 days, the 4 teens looked better than the fellows who had been eating T-bone steak at the king's table. Sorry about you steak lovers on that. They looked so good that the guard let them continue with their strange diet indefinitely. So here's something we learn. God blesses those who make up their minds to honor Him. The story comes to an end on a very positive note, and we discover in these verses that God always honors those who honor Him. And in this case, the reward became very, very quickly. Sometimes, probably from our own experience, it takes much longer than that. And sometimes when we're faithful, our reward doesn't come until we get to heaven. And I mentioned the timing part simply because it's possible to read the rest of this story and get the idea that every time we're going to stand up for our convictions, we will be immediately rewarded. This passage proves that sometimes it does happen that way, but let's remember that God's timing and our timing are often different. So I think it's appropriate to marvel at Daniel's reward, but at the same time, we need to remember in many parts of the world today, we have brothers and sisters who are paying with their blood for standing up for Jesus Christ. They're losing their lives because of their faith in Christ. So we can marvel at Daniel's reward, but also we need to remember that God deals with us as individuals. This is our call. Our call is to be faithful, knowing that in the end, whether it's on earth or whether it's in heaven, no one is going to regret standing up for Jesus. Look at verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. That guaranteed that they were heads above their other Jewish contemporaries that were brought into captivity, put into the Operation Assimilation program as well. They stood heads above the Babylonians. And by the way, it's important that we notice the order. First, it was the decision to take the stand for what they believed. Secondly, God honored their decision. Thirdly, God then gave them wisdom and understanding. And the last part of verse 17 skips really to the end of the 3 years of their education. King Nebuchadnezzar is going to test all of these guys. That is sort of the ultimate oral exam, where you have been through all the schooling, but now then you go before the king. And the king's going to ask you questions on history, on science, and economics, the language. probably also ask you some details about the Babylonian religion. And these young men had to know all of this stuff, know everything that the other young leaders had to know. And the result was the king found them 10 times smarter than the magicians and the enchanters in his kingdom. So they went to the head of the class. They immediately entered into the king's service. And then verse 21 adds this, that Daniel remained in the court of Babylon until the first year of Cyrus. He served as an advisor to a whole series of Babylonian kings for over 60 years, serving them. Here are the lessons for today. This is our takeaway. I think we glean from this text. The world continually tries to reprogram us in a different way of thinking. We talked about that last week. The world continually tries to reprogram us into a different way of thinking. It still attempts to separate us from our spiritual heritage. All of us are bombarded with anti-God input from the media every day. Make no mistake, in the 21st century, there is a battle for our minds, a battle that's being fought every day. We see this is what was happening to Daniel and his friends. Second takeaway, we must make up our minds in advance. We're going to be loyal to God. You have to decide that you will not compromise in those things that matter. For Daniel, that meant not eating the king's food at the king's table. Now, it doesn't matter that we today don't fully understand his decision. What's important is Daniel drew a line in the sand and he says, this far and no farther. See, if we don't do that, we end up being just like the Babylonians all around us. And then there's this third takeaway today. Godly convictions yield God-given rewards. Notice, what starts with Daniel ends with God. What starts with courage ends with a lifetime of blessing. Look what God did for Daniel. He protected him. He prospered him. He promoted him. And the good news from Daniel 1, that it's possible to live for God because Daniel has shown us how to do that. In 1873, Philip P. Bliss wrote a gospel song about this story. It was very popular during his day. It's virtually unknown today, but if you Google it, you can find it online. And the title of the song is the title of this message, Dare to Be Daniel. And these are the words that Bliss wrote. Standing by a purpose true, heeding God's command, honor them, the faithful few, all hail to Daniel's band. Many mighty men are lost, daring not to stand. Who for God has been a host by joining Daniel's band? Many giants, great and tall, stalking through the land, headlong to the earth would fall if met by Daniel's band. Hold the gospel banner high, on to victory grand. Satan and his host defy, and shout for Daniel's band. And the chorus goes, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. The application for this message is very simple. Let's dare to be a Daniel this week. Take the stands. Be ready to stand for your faith. Be ready to fight the battles that the world throws at us. Because we belong to God. And where it may start with us, remember, it ends with God. He's still in control. He's still our God. And He will be victorious in the end. We know that victory came with a price. It came with the price of Jesus dying on the cross for us. That was the biggest test a person could go through, is say, I'm going to take on the sins of the world and die for them. You may be here this morning and you haven't made a choice, a decision, a faith decision of trusting and following Christ. We invite you this morning to make that choice, to make that decision, to say yes. Ask Jesus to forgive your sins and to come into your life and be Lord of your life. Maybe here this morning as a church member, as a Christian, and you're willing to take a stand and say, you know what, I'm going to be a Daniel this week. We invite you, even as we sing, for you to make that choice and that decision, even now. We're going to stand together. Ron, what hymn number are we singing today? Hymn number 305, Jesus Paid It All.